billion, more or less. That includes all the stuff, all the services we deliver to you every day, the TTC, the Toronto Police Service, our road maintenance, parks, forestry, recreation, everything like that. It includes the parking authority. It includes the separate garbage rate and water rate that you pay on your tax bill. That's our 2022 expenditure. When council does a budget, it also puts in place a 10-year capital plan. Now, it's just a plan. It's not all committed. And that's worth a little over $46.5 billion. So that's just the scale of what we're talking about during the budget tonight, budget presentation tonight. We go to the next slide. So before we get into the details, I think it's really important to highlight that we're in very unusual times for the city making our budget. One very dramatic thing for any of you who've taken transit in the last couple of years will know, there are way fewer people riding the TTC, but we are still trying to run a lot of service. So the money we collect from fares is way down. And that's true of a number of other services as well. It's true that our parking authority revenues are down. Our revenues for permits at our various facilities are down. There's a whole lot of stuff that we're just not bringing in money for that would normally help us budget our balance our budget. On top of that, we have a whole lot of extra costs. We have critical housing needs and public health needs that we are spending on in numbers that are much greater than we've ever spent on before. I'm going to get a little bit into whether it's enough later on, but it's nevertheless a lot of cost. And you can see over the last 3 years, starting from that $15 billion number, we've had about $1.5 billion each year that we have had to make up some other way. And as much as we've tried to make it up by getting support from other orders of government, every year we have also had to make cuts, I'll be frank, in some of the services that we deliver in order to balance our budget. Some of that has been fairly painless because there are some services we haven't offered during the pandemic, but some of it has brought real pain, and I'll get into that too. You can see the numbers for each year there. We could have the next slide. Sky, yeah, there we go. I wanted to give a little sense of some of the areas where we've really been struggling, even though they're not City of Toronto responsibility. Different governments have different responsibilities for what they're supposed to pay for. Traditionally in Canada, building housing is the responsibility of the federal and provincial governments. Delivering social programs like childcare, Ontario Works, Ontario Disability, things like that, they're supposed to be federal and provincial responsibilities. And there are a number of healthcare services that the city provides that are also supposed to be federal and provincial responsibilities. But as you can see, we've been directly investing as a city over $1 billion in those areas. So that adds to the pressure that we're facing. If I could have the next slide. This is the conversation that we're having with those governments about getting support to help us manage that. We have brought about $1.5 billion in on transit mostly, a fair amount on shelters, public health, obviously, and then all of our other impacts, we have got some help. This is mostly from the federal government Safe Restart Agreement. We did get some transit money from the province of Ontario one time, and a little bit of one-time money for housing support workers. But as we're going to discuss later on, the province really hasn't stepped up. There are two very big asks in the budget that's drafted both of which have to do with housing. The federal government is supposed to help us pay the cost of resettling any refugees who arrive in Toronto. And we've got an ask out to them for $61 million to help with that. And we have been asking the province, who are supposed to provide supports to people who need help to maintain their tenure. We call it supportive housing. That's supposed to be a provincial responsibility. Last year, they gave us a little bit of money on a one-time basis, and we have an outstanding ask to them for $27 million that they haven't yet got back to us on. Next slide. So now to the main budget. So I told you off the top that we spend about 15 billion. The main operating budget, that's the one your property taxes principally pay for, is about 13 billion of that. The rest, as I described, are the parking authority, which runs its own budget out of the revenues from people parking. The water department, you get a separate line for water and sewer on your budget bill or your tax bill. And what's the one I just forgot? Garbage. You also pay a per bin rate for garbage. So that's funded in a different budget. Those three budgets have already been approved. The part we're talking about tonight is the 13 billion remaining. Next slide. So I know this is a lot to look at, but I'll just very quickly go through this. This shows where the money comes from and where it goes. As I mentioned, the property tax is our main source of revenue. And that property tax, as I said, includes property taxes for homeowners, for apartment dwellers, for businesses, and for industry. That's the all-in number there. Next, we have money from the federal and provincial government. And you can see part of that bar there is light blue. That's because we haven't got it yet. We're counting on it, but we haven't got it. We get a fair bit from TTC fares. We get a fair bit from the land transfer tax, user fees. That's, if you're paying for a building permit, or if you're renting a community center or paying for a recreation program, all of that stuff. Then there's a bunch of small things. I want to point out there's reserves. Every year we put aside money for a rainy day. Boy, are we having a rainy day. Let's go over to where the money goes. So the biggest thing is the cost shared social programs. That's childcare, long-term care, homes for the aged, some of the housing that we offer gets some money from other orders of government. It's cost shared. It's also Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support Program. The City of Toronto is one of the few municipalities that runs the social service program for the province of Ontario. Even though it's called Ontario Disability and Ontario Works, they give us the money, we administer it, we provide the casework support. I will note that on a per case basis, we do it far cheaper than the province does in the rest of the province. The next biggest one is transit. Then there are emergency services. I'm going to say about 3/4 of that is the police, and the rest is paramedics, ambulance, and fire. Financing, that's when we borrow money to build things that are going to last a long time, a new community center, something like that, we will borrow. The financing is paying the debt off on those long-term projects. And then you just have everything else. If you add up all the parks and recreation, all the transportation services, everything else that we do is only about 8% of our budget. So that gives you a sense how big transit, police, and those cost shared programs are. Okay, on to the next slide. So there are a few new things that are in this budget. We're adding $32 million to childcare, and you can see the other numbers, 18 on long-term care, 14 on housing. We have a new program on reconciliation and combating anti-Black racism. I want to point out that these are increases over what we actually spent last year. We had budgeted for a lot of things last year, but because the pandemic was lingering, we didn't spend as much in some areas. So we'll take housing as an example. Even though there's an increase in what we're budgeting this year on housing, it's not actually even as much money as we spent last year, or as we budgeted last year. It's more than what we spent, but not as much as what we budgeted. There's some community safety and crisis response. I'm going to spend a bunch of time on crisis response later. There's a bunch of IT stuff that we have to do. We, particularly because of so many people having to do everything virtually, we've really had to expand our IT programs. And some of that will continue on into the future. Since we've moved some of our services onto the internet, we're likely to get that capacity in place after the pandemic. Next. So this is what it's going to cost. Each of the different property tax categories. By provincial law, we have five different categories of property taxes that we're allowed to collect. We can only collect from these five, and everybody within a category pays the same rate times the value of their property. So every residence is going to get a 2.9% increase, but if the value of your property is more than your neighbor's, that will be more actual dollars. And as you can see, residential is going up the most. That's because 10, 15 years ago, we decided that the fact that businesses were paying 3 times as much per assessed dollar, and industry was paying 3 times as much per assessed dollar, we would bring those ratios down from 3 to 1 to 2 to 1. And until that had happened, we would cap the relative increase for property taxes for businesses. This will be maybe the last year we do that. We're going to hit the 2 to 1, and in some cases 2.5 to 1 this year, and then the property tax increase will be uniform. You will see that for multi-residential, the property tax increase is 0. That's because for years and years, apartment buildings, because they were commercial enterprises, were taxed more like a business than like a home. So tenants who had the property tax passed along to them were paying more money per square foot for their apartment in municipal taxes than homeowners were. And that's not right. So they're frozen as we bring that ratio down. There's also a very special one-time thing we're doing because of the pandemic. Small businesses, and this is literally just like your neighborhood convenience store or your neighborhood dry cleaner or your neighborhood restaurant, just those very small businesses, we're giving them an extra 15% discount this year because so many of them are on the verge of bankruptcy or struggling to keep open. If you're the average house, if you're the average house, that 3% or 2.9, say you're assessed at about, I think it's, I'm going to say $4,500 assessment usually. That's the average amount someone pays. This year, you'll pay another $93 on top of that $4,500. I want to get to the next slide. There is an additional levy that we're putting on. It's called the City Building Fund. You might remember in previous town halls, I've argued that the City of Toronto had a real funding problem, and we needed to be able to bring new money in. It took 10 years, but I was able to convince the rest of council to agree with me. So we have something called the City Building Fund, and that's an additional 1.5% property tax increase on all property tax categories with the same ratios applied. So on top of the $98 I just described is going to be another 48, so $146 for the average home. That's the property tax increase this year, all in. Next slide. Okay, this is similar to something I showed you about where property taxes go. We've already seen some of this, so I'll skip to the next one. So I'm now going to talk about the city's capital plan. As I said before, we borrow money to build things, and that's treated differently than our operating budget. By law, the City of Toronto's operating budget is required, has to be balanced. We can't spend more than we bring in. For things that we buy that are going to last a long time, we are allowed to borrow. So this budget is looking at what our plans are for the next 10 years for those big ticket items. And to just give you one example, if we buy a bus or build streetcar line or build a new subway station, that's capital. The diesel fuel or electricity to move that vehicle and the operator who's driving it, those are operating costs. Okay, so this is for our capital plan where the money comes from. A quarter of it is debt. Quarter of it is that city building fund that I was talking about. Next, there's something called capital from current. What we do there is we take money out of our operating revenue, so out of the property tax, and add it back into the capital. Usually that's for things that are only going to last a couple or 3 years. Say we're buying computer equipment, and it just doesn't make sense to borrow on the long term for it. But increasingly, we've also been relying on that capital from current to pay for some of our longer term projects. And you can see that there's federal funding there, that we are taking money out of some of our longer term reserves. There's something called recoverable debt. If we borrow money for something that's going to pay us back, we call that recoverable debt. You can see there's a little bit of provincial funding there at the bottom as well. So the big ticket items there are transit and housing, although you'll see in that case, the way we're funding it is, or the cost that we're getting is, when certain people build affordable housing, we might say, you don't have to pay property taxes on it for 20 years. So that's the foregone revenue. We have to show it as a cost there. Transportation, that's mostly the Gardner Expressway, but there is some money left over for other things. Environment is a whole big pile of mishmash of stuff. The city's deciding to show that separately because of our commitment to a climate plan. And then you have various other things. Next slide. Okay, this is the schedule. On Thursday, last Thursday, the city made its budget public. Starting today and going tomorrow and the next day, there are hearings that councillors can attend to ask questions of staff about details of what's in that budget. I spent the whole day doing that. That's what I'm going to be doing tomorrow and the day after as well. The important date for you to keep in mind is January 24th and 25th. That's when members of the public can make deputations on the budget. Then it goes back to the budget committee in January and February, where they tie up all the things they've heard together. Then they send it along to the executive committee. That's the mayor's hand-picked committee. It's all the chairs of the various committees of council on February 11th. And then city council debates it all February 17th. Okay, I think that's our presentation. And I got it done in 22 minutes. So we're going to go to questions. I've seen a couple things flash by me in the chat. I know, Chris, you've been monitoring it. Is there a tee-off question I should address first?
I have a couple about the slide deck, actually. Sky, if you don't mind, if you could go back to slide 7. What are the corporate accounts in the budget right after the city programs?
Okay. So the corporate accounts, that's some of that is the reserve funds. Some of it is strange things. So we have, for example, something called the Home Energy Loan Program, or HELP. That we lend people money against future tax revenue. It's a really complicated thing. That's sort of a catch-all for all kinds of different things that don't fit straight and easy into the main categories.
And on slide 8, Sky, what does mobility refer to?
Which column? Mobility.
Under safe and livable city, 7.5 million.
Oh, mobility. That's a whole variety of things. Mostly when we put mobility in there, we mean things like providing services to people who are mobility challenged. So wheel-trans, things like that. But there are some things captured in that as well. Providing additional clearing of snow, curb cuts in areas where we don't yet have full accessibility.
And finally, from the slide deck, on slide 9, where do condominiums fall in regards to taxes? Are they residential or
Residential. Condominium units are taxed at the residential rate.
Great.
Okay.
And we've had a couple questions that were sent to us in advance.
Sure.
A good one to start off with is, can you explain how the budget works for someone new to the process? Are we looking at new spending, or do we need to worry about previously announced items? For example, we were told that our park was going to be refurbished in 2022. Could this be removed now?
That sounds like a straightforward question, but it's not. So, first of all, the budget, the way that the staff prepare the budget is they take last year's actual spending. So we'll take the transportation department, for example, on the operating side. So that's all the costs of snow plowing, fixing traffic lights that are broken, all those day-to-day costs and the staff costs. They take last year's number in any programs we were running last year. They ask the staff, what are the changes? Are there programs that have expired and we're dropping? Are there new things you're adding on? And they show they show those changes. So most of our budgeting is actual to next year. We try to highlight where there are changes. It changes, it's different for the capital plan. When council approves its 10-year capital plan, practically speaking, we authorize the staff to do the capital work that has to start in 2022. If we've made a commitment in the 10-year plan that in 2024 we're going to build a new community center, it's not formally going to be funded until we get to the 2024 budget and pass that year's budget. So the fact that we've been told something might happen in year 6 or year 8 of the 10-year capital plan, it can change. It can change. Right now, Chris and I are busy grinding through probably about 1,000 pages of budget documents to check all the projects that we expected for 22 are actually in there. To date, it looks in the few budget areas where I've checked so far, like things are still on schedule, but we haven't finished that review yet.
Okay, so next question. Is the city in talks with the feds / the province on trying to figure out the childcare plan?
We have let both the federal and provincial government know our views. City Council has voted repeatedly that we want the same deal that every other province is getting on childcare. Ontario remains the only province in the entire country that has yet to sign a childcare deal with the federal government. But no, the talks on how that program would go are direct government to government. We are providing advice to both governments because the program in the city of Toronto is unique. No other municipality runs it the way we do. We have very high standards of quality, but also we contribute. An old memory tells me it's 20% of the cost of the program. As well, we use some of our development-related money to help build new childcare centers. And we have pay equity rules in place and quality rules in place for our childcare system that is different from some of the other municipalities in Ontario. So we want a seat at the table, but the big thing about getting to yes with the province of Ontario, that's a federal provincial conversation. And I urge each and every one of you to let the Premier of Ontario know that it is insane that Ontario is the only province who hasn't signed on yet.
Our next question is about housing. You said housing was a provincial issue. Why do we only talk about it at the city level? Is there a provincial and or federal version of TCHC or anything like that, etc.?
Okay. So for 60 years after the Great Depression, all three governments contributed to affordable housing. There was something called City Home, which was directly run by the city. There were federal housing programs. Mostly they funded housing for other orders of government, and they provided a lot of support to the co-op movement. The province also had a housing company, but starting in about 1998, the federal government and the provincial government got out of housing entirely and dumped the responsibility onto the city of Toronto. The Ontario Housing Corporation units that were in the city of Toronto were put together with City Home and became the what we now call Toronto Community Housing. At that time, the federal and provincial government, when they gave us responsibility for housing, they didn't give us money for maintenance and repairs. So if you're running a big apartment building, you know that 20 years from now, you're going to have to fix your boiler. You sock away a little bit of money every year for 20 years so that when it hits, it isn't a big expense. When they dumped housing on the city of Toronto, they did not give us those reserve funds. And that's why so much of our housing was in a state of disrepair for so long. We have been fighting to catch up. We continue to say that the province and the federal government owe us money in this area. The federal government does have a housing program, but most of where they're spending money on what they call the Rapid Housing Initiative. The way that one works is if we can get them a proposal to build new housing and get it from the day we submit it to the day it opens, if we can do it in 18 months, they'll help us. If it takes any longer, they don't really want to talk to us. That's the federal government. The provincial government, it might as well be the provincial government of Alberta for all the help they're giving us. I was looking at a capital budget for housing yesterday, and I saw that the city of Toronto is putting in $850 million into housing. The provincial government is putting in $3 million. Next question.
Our next question is about the budget process.
Yeah.
They say it seems the budget process becomes more and more truncated every year. Just one month with 2 days of public deputations seems absurd. Agree?
I absolutely agree. It used to be that the budget was made public in mid-December, and everyone had, a few weeks to look at it, and then time for the community to have a conversation. That time got cut in half under John Tory. I saw the budget Thursday. I'm expected to ask intelligent questions of the staff Tuesday, today, tomorrow, and the day after, and then budget deputations happen like in 10 days or something. So no, it is unbelievably truncated. It is way less participatory and democratic than it used to be. It's something we should all make known to members of council and the mayor as not being satisfactory. You can't budget for a complex city like this in a matter of a few weeks.
Our next question, is cycling infrastructure covered in mobility?
Cycling infrastructure is in the transportation budget. And if you remember from one of the early slides, you saw all those bar graphs. It basically went, Sky, do you have it? Transportation is on there for the operating side, not the capital.
Okay, let me pull it up here.
Yeah. It's the where the money goes to one for the operating. I think up one more slide. There you go.
This
7.
one?
Yeah. So I know
Sorry.
the numbers.
Hold on.
Oh, it went away.
Oh, sorry.
Slide 7.
This one?
Yeah, there you go. So that's so yeah, it's $440 million for the transportation budget. That's the operating day to day. And if we could go to the capital, it's a few more slides along. Oh, there you go.
Oh, there it is. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, transportation over the 10-year period, it's 5.4 billion. I will tell you right now, that includes the Gardner Expressway rebuild. That's actually most of it. We had a slide on some general transportation issues. Sky, could you pull that one up? Okay. So one of the things I've been struggling with the rest of council for a few years now, since the Gardner happened, since the city decided to do the Gardner, everything else has been squeezed. So the money for what the rest of council calls Vision Zero is very, very small compared to the huge needs. We can't seem to expand the automated speed enforcement or the community safety zones. But I did get some money allocated for Parkside Drive, some money for some work to make High Park, a study of how to make it more balanced in terms of the way transportation works. We're doing the work on King Queen Roncesvalles, which is going to expand some bike infrastructure and make the terrible and dangerous intersection at King Queen Roncesvalles much more pedestrian friendly. We're actually taking a bunch of what used to be road and turning it into parkland. There's work due on the Kingsway Jane Bloor intersection. We've got some money for speed bump traffic calming coming in. There's money in the capital plan for the Dundas, DuPont, Annette, Old West intersection. There's money in, not this year, I believe. I think there's some study money, but the actual construction money for the Bloor West bike lane extension. Some of that's in there. And we're bringing an update on the waterfront master plan, which would dramatically improve pedestrian and cycling and transit access to the waterfront. So high level, that's that stuff. Thanks, Scott. You can take that down now. I asked the general manager of transportation on the day of budget launch, is there additional money citywide for safer transportation, the Vision Zero? Is that budget going to be any bigger this year than it was last year? And the answer I got is no. It's very concerning. And this is one of the main things I think we as a community are going to have to advocate for between now and February, when the budget is voted on at council.
Okay, so our next question. It appears the city continues to operate at full capacity when the buses in many parts of the city are empty during the pandemic. Has there been any change in scheduling to save money during the pandemic? TTC ridership is down 60% while traffic volumes are down 20%.
So there has been a reduction in transit service. I'm one of those who have been arguing to try to keep that reduction as small as possible for a couple of reasons. One is we've been trying to maintain a high level of safety on transit vehicles, and you can't stay safe during a pandemic if you're really overcrowded. Even with that, though, we are still finding on a lot of our bus routes that the vehicles are overcrowded. So I'm going to be advocating for additional bus service beyond what's budgeted here. It's got to the point where the TTC is now running vehicles in the middle of winter with the windows open to try to ventilate them. So if anything, I would say we've reduced the service too far. The other thing is the decisions people make about transportation are ones that have lasting impacts. If you decide transit's not working for you and you go out and buy a car, you're going to keep driving, or a second car for your household. You're going to keep driving that car until it's a junk heap. And that means we've lost you for 5-10 years. So we need to keep the service at a good level and make it more attractive. Additionally, this year, the city adopted a climate plan for what we have to do for Toronto to contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions so that we don't have catastrophic climate change, or more catastrophic climate change than what we've experienced so far. To do that, we would need to dramatically increase transit ridership. I was in a discussion today that for the bus system, just the bus system, we'd have to be at 70% more than we were pre-pandemic. If you are going to build up ridership, you can't do that by cutting back on service. Next.
I just had a question, I think, going back to our road safety and transportation slide. Someone just asked to explain what Vision Zero is.
Vision Zero is a plan announced by the mayor and approved by City Council what they said, the vision was to have 0 people killed or seriously injured by cars on city streets. It's turned out to be rather less than that. What it mostly is now are some interventions in what we call community safety zones. Council voted, I dissented, to limit those community safety zones to areas around schools. Last week, Councillor Layton put a motion in front of a committee on my behalf, his behalf, and Councillor Wong-Tam's behalf, asking to turn our entire wards into community safety zones. Kids play on streets, or go to childcare, or visit, or just go for walks everywhere in our neighborhoods, not just in front of schools. Unfortunately, the idea of Vision Zero that most members of council support doesn't protect you except in those very few areas. That's why I'm so concerned there's no additional money for Vision Zero in this year's budget.
Our next question has to do with Transform TO. I'm just going to share my screen again because I know we have a slide for that as well.
Okay.
Okay. So the question is, previously you shared that you had concerns about funding for Transform TO despite the fact that the report passed. Is this a problem?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. If we are going to prevent catastrophic climate change, we have to remember that the place where we can have the greatest impact is cities. Cities have the tools and the population to do the most and the most quickly to reduce emissions. And big cities like Toronto are particularly important. We have a plan that has a goal for making Toronto net zero by 2040. Unfortunately, many of the things that we need to do to get there are going to cost real bucks. They're going to cost real bucks. There are some things that the province and the federal government have to do in partnership with us, and there are some things we have to do. The one that I am most concerned about, and I was just talking about this, is public transportation. If you think of it, close to half of the greenhouse gas emissions that happen in a city happen because of heating buildings where people work or live or shop. And there are things that we can do about that, but a lot of it is stuff that we need to do in a regulatory way. We need a tougher building code. The next big one at 35-40% is transportation, and most of that is cars. And if we are going to meet our goals, we have to massively move people out of their cars, get them walking more, get people cycling more, but transit is going to have to be the big one. As I said just a moment ago, the guess we have at this point is that we need to get about 70% more buses on the road. Right now we have somewhere around 2,000. That number should be more like 3,500. We got to increase the streetcar fleet by about 50%. And there's a piece we have to do on subway frequency. We can't do much on the peak there. We're running pretty close to what we're capable of doing, but we need to run those same subway cars in the less busy hours as well. And the budget does not exist for any of this. Just 2 hours ago, I was on with someone from the TTC. And I said, do you have any budget plan for that kind of fleet expansion? And he had to say no.
So I think this is
other aspects of Transform TO. Chris and I are still digging into those numbers. I wish I could tell you more about it now, but because it's so compressed, I had to go before I had a chance to learn every detail.
So I think this is a follow-up question to Transform TO. Do you have a plan to address this at the upcoming meeting, and how can we voice our concerns about this?
So yes, I do very much intend to raise it. I have a couple more kicks at the can. I've been meeting behind the scenes with Transform TO staff and TTC staff and budget staff for about 2 months to try to get this ironed out. I've had mixed success so far. I'm going to be raising it during what we call the budget reviews, where I get to ask staff from each department questions. First day of that was today, second day tomorrow, third day Thursday. Although I applied to be on the budget committee, I'm not on the budget committee, so I can't move any motions there. I've talked to Councillor Layton, who is on the budget committee, and he's keeping his eye on the ball and we're looking at what motions we can move there. The big moment though, Sky, what was the date again for the public deputations? Well, don't pull it up. At the end, we're going to have a what you can do slide. So if you stick with us for a little while longer, we'll put the dates and the contact information because, you know, I know you guys are as anxious to get this climate plan in place as I am. And we're going to lay out who you talk to, how you sign up to make a deputation and all of that just a little later on in the meeting.
I believe it's January 24th and 25th though, but
Okay.
we'll put it all
up.
information on
Good.
the screen at
Thanks.
the end. We're going to jump to some questions about the police.
Yes.
Just gonna get my screen. Oops. So what is your position on the budget increase for the Toronto Police Services?
So I took the position, starting 4 years ago. I've been supporting various motions to reduce the police service budget and to transfer that money over to what we call community crisis response. Many of you will know that one of our neighbors, Regis Korchinski-Capet, died during died during an encounter with the Toronto police a year and a half ago. We believe very strongly that if for a whole lot of calls, mental health calls, wellness calls, calls having to do with people seeking shelter, overdose calls, it's inappropriate to have someone in a police uniform with a taser on one hip and a gun on the other show up to respond to those calls. And we have been trying to get budget transferred from the police to what we call a community crisis response instead. This is done in a number of American cities. It's not as advanced there as I would like to see, but it is growing. After a lengthy fight at council, we managed to convince them. We couldn't get them to go the whole way towards just transferring money, but we did get them to set up 4 initial community crisis response programs. They are due to come in this year. Only one of them will cover any part of Ward 4. It's one that's providing services for response when Indigenous people are in crisis. We don't have a full community crisis response program coming into Ward 4 this year. I've been working with a number of community agencies in Ward 4, and they've developed a model for how they could take that challenge up. One of my fights this year at the budget will be to get city staff to allocate resources so we can shape that program and get it up and running within a year. Today, I went back and forth with city staff when I was reviewing their budget. They have something in, they say it's to help pre-qualify community organizations to participate in this program, but it's not money to expand it in this year. And so that's going to be something just like the climate plan, where I'm going to have to count on you all to make your voices heard over the next few weeks. In a moment where we are struggling to deliver basic services, we cannot be expanding the police budget.
So staying on the topic of police, where do you stand on the fact that the Toronto Police are looking for an increase of 2.3% or $24 million over last year? There's virtually no increase in crime.
Yeah, as I just said, I'm not supportive of an increase in the police budget. In fact, in my view, we would be taking money out of the police budget and providing it to a lot of other services which help people and don't need police response.
Okay, so just jumping new topic. When is the Junction HCD priority study going to happen?
I don't have that detail yet. I believe it's tomorrow that I get to ask detailed questions of the planning department on all the various different studies they're supposed to do. I'll take this moment to alert you to another problem that I've been trying to highlight for a few years now. In a couple of areas where we rely on professional expertise, planning, construction management, engineering, we have had trouble hiring and retaining staff. The private sector and some other municipalities just pay better than we do. It's got to the point where even before Omicron hit, we were experiencing significant staffing shortages, 15-20% in some areas. I have been raising this all year at almost every council meeting. City staff have assured me that they have added resources to those budgets so that we can hire up to fill those positions. I got into it today with the chief financial officer. She has promised me by today or tomorrow an update on how long it's going to take to fill in those areas where we are currently short-staffed. I'm going to be sending updates through the budget process, and I'll let you know when that happens. But that's a key reason why things like the heritage study or some of the area studies or some of the avenue studies are not appearing in as timely a way as we all want them to.
Got a question asking, why hasn't the Wabash Community Center broken ground yet? Is this because of budget/capital?
No, it's scheduled. It's on the schedule that it's supposed to be. It was not due to break ground this year. It's due in 21. My understanding, and it's either late this year or early next year that we're supposed to break ground. I don't have that date yet. That's one of the things, because that's one of the pieces that Chris and I are still investigating. There is some early work that has to happen on site as sort of a first phase, but the one COVID related thing that did contribute to maybe losing a few months is some of the consultation work that we were trying to do with the community got pushed back a little bit. It was supposed to happen just as the first wave of the pandemic was in place, and the city hadn't yet set up for virtual consultation. So it's a tiny bit behind schedule, but in terms of what year it's supposed to happen and all that stuff, it's always been 22. It's still 22.
Our next question, where does art and culture fit into the budget? Or bigger events like the Polish Fest or Dundas West? Not sure if this is partially city funded or all privately funded.
Okay. So there are different ways the city funds arts and culture. Principally, we do it through our economic development department. We have yet to get our detailed questions answered there. We also fund something called the Toronto Arts Council, which directly funds artists. And we have a variety of festivals. The festivals we usually do in partnership with local business improvement associations. So the Polish Festival, for example, we do in partnership with the Roncesvalles BIA. The Ukrainian Festival, we do in partnership with the Bloor West Village BIA. They pay most of the direct costs. The city picks up a lot of in-kind costs. So for example, during the Polish Festival, we have to reroute a lot of TTC vehicles. The city generally picks up most of those costs.
Our next question is about the waterfront. Are there any initiatives to promote access to the waterfront for all citizens? Toronto has an amazing waterfront, but recent initiatives like Active TO greatly limits access to bring a kayak to the waterfront.
Right. So one of the things that has sort of been a long-term project for me on council, I got through with the help of Mayor David Miller, something called the Western Waterfront Master Plan. And that was all about the fact that it's crazy that it's easier for someone from Mississauga to go down to Sunnyside for the day than it is for someone from Bloor West or Roncesvalles or Parkdale to get there. And we had a number of pieces that were part of that. We've done a couple of them already. There are two new traffic lights to help people get north-south down to the waterfront, one at the Palais Royal and one at Dunn. We have pedestrianized the bridge at Dunn. It used to be only for cars, now it's only for people and bikes. But there were some big moves that we really needed to make. One piece of it was to physically move the lakeshore up against the Gardner to open up a whole lot more new parkland. Last year at council, I got direction to staff to provide an update. I think that update is coming in the next 3 or 4 months to council, and I'll have more to report then. Yeah.
Okay, our next question is.
And I'm sorry. Part of that is also a new public docks at Dowling Beach.
Okay, so next question is about Toronto Public Libraries. Curious to know about the funding for Toronto Public Libraries, which have been chronically defunded, yet expected to fulfill their core function, yet also serve as de facto drop-ins for low-income and unhoused people.
Yeah, good question. Very good question. So the Toronto Public Library, I sit on the library board now. This term is the first time I've done that. You're absolutely right. The number of staff hours fell dramatically after amalgamation. And you know, the number of hours that were open and so on. I'm one of the people on council who has fought for two things. One is the open hours plan to try to reinstate services on things like Sundays or Saturday evenings or late nights, because some neighborhoods, you know, having a library open at midnight makes sense. We have been gradually chipping away at that. There is some progress on it in this year's draft budget, but nowhere near as much as I'd like to see. There's also a deliberate intervention we were making to create youth spaces in a number of our branches. Unfortunately, because of pandemic restrictions, all of that work got slowed down. It's really hard to, you know, expand a program when the library is closed by provincial order. Excuse me. One thing that is in this this year's budget is we're beginning the process of eliminating all fines for adults. Last year we did it for kids. This year we're doing it for adults. It's something that American libraries have been doing for a while. It's become very clear that overdue fines are becoming a barrier to access for a lot of people. Yeah, so I'm with you. We need to be expanding libraries, particularly because they're one of the places in the city that are open to everyone all the time.
Hi, Gord. Just to go back a couple items. The Wabash is expected to start construction in spring of next year.
So spring of 23. Okay, thank you, Chris.
And that, of course, is subject to COVID changes, which has slowed down construction before.
Yeah.
Just going to a question that we recently talked about. What beach was the council referring to for the new public dock?
Dowling. It's called the Dowling. It's so if you know where Toronto Sailing and Canoe is. It's just to the east of that.
Okay, so reports keep saying that extreme weather is going to be more common going forward. Are we investing in things like snow trucks now so we can better handle storms so people do not end up stuck on the highway?
One of the sort of never-ending issues at council is there are those of us who believe that city services like that should be directly delivered by the City of Toronto, and some believe we should contract them out. Since amalgamation, the people who believe it should be contracted out have won. So we don't actually own snow trucks as the City of Toronto anymore. We contract private companies to deliver that service. We did get a small fleet, I think it's 40 vehicles, to start doing some sidewalk snow clearing. This is the first year we're doing it in some of the downtown neighborhoods that are far more crowded than suburban areas where they get sidewalk snow clearing already. But you know, that little fleet was just, you know, totally overwhelmed by the big dump we just got. From what I've been able to see, this is the biggest 24-hour snowfall we've had since the late 70s. So no amount of preparation would have made it an easy peasy 1, 2, 3 and you're done. You can never budget for that kind of storm. In terms of preparation for climate change, one of the things we have been trying to do is to reorient all of our infrastructure. And it's a much bigger deal than just snow. So as I'm fond of saying, the city we live in has infrastructure that isn't built for the climate we're going to live in. We have the wrong infrastructure. And nobody can really put a price tag on it, but here are some of the things we're going to have to think through. We have to make sure that every single building in the City of Toronto, whether publicly owned or privately owned, can stay cool during a massive heat wave. Otherwise, there are literally, and we ran an exercise on this, hundreds of thousands of people who are at risk of dying in a severe heat wave in the City of Toronto. We're going to have to redo how we handle not just snow, but rainfall. You might remember about 10 years ago, a large part of Steeles or Finch washed out because they had a sudden rainstorm, 100-year storm, they called it. Then the year after that, the water system failed down at Sunnyside, and Sunnyside Beach washed out into Lake Ontario, and Gus Ryder Pool had to be closed. So it's a massive undertaking, and that's part of what I'm looking for when I ask city staff, are you ready for climate change? And no one really knows the extent of the investment we have to make on all of that. And I think we need to keep pushing, even if the numbers are big and scary, to make them explicit so that we can get to work on making the changes.
Okay. Our next question. Why does the city have staff to get the developer's project through approvals, but the HCD can't get done so it can protect the historic areas of Toronto while they still exist?
The province of Ontario mandates that when a development application comes in, we have, I think it's 90 or 120 days to complete the review. And if we have not done that, the applicant has an automatic free pass to the provincial land use planning appeal tribunal, what we used to call the OMB, and they decide. So if we don't meet those deadlines, we have no say in the development at all. That's provincial law. That's not something council has any control over.
Okay, our next question is, what motions do you plan to bring forward regarding the budget? Specifically, you mentioned the outrageous increase to the police budget above inflation. Will you be making any motion against the police funding?
So I belong to a group of 6 or 7 like-minded councillors who sort of work cooperatively on the budget. It's just with the new compressed timetable, it's just too much for any one of us to be able to do it. It used to be when there was time, I could look everything up myself and know it all, but so we sort of hive it off. The other thing is, each member of council gets 1 5-minute speech at council on the budget, only 1 5-minute speech. So that limits the number of motions that I can make. Believe me, I've already got like 20 minutes worth of motions I'd like to move. So I will give you an undertaking. There will be a motion that somebody moves to take money out of the police to accelerate the community crisis response work. I don't know if it will be me, and I don't know what the dollar value will be. That's something that we have to talk to our communities about. We have to talk to each other about. But there will be something.
What are the things you should suggest or recommend we deprioritize so that we can have some of our important causes prioritized?
Well, I've given one example, which is that I think it's that the community crisis response is both safer and more cost effective. Another one, and this is one that I've talked about before and I'll talk about again. I believe that when we collect taxes from Torontonians, whether it's property tax or if we get a new revenue source like sales tax, for the overwhelming majority of us, the value of the services that we get in exchange is greater than what we pay in taxes. My best guess is that, let's say we put 1 cent or 1% on the sales tax and the city had access to it, about 80% of Torontonians would get more back in value in terms of services than the cost of that sales tax to them. Similarly, the property tax, it's about 4 out of 5 of us would save money because of the services we got compared to how much more we paid in taxes. So I think a priority that many on council, including the mayor, have had, which is to keep taxes low, is a priority we got to throw out the window. If we want to rebuild and build back better and face the affordability crisis and the climate crisis and the opioid crisis facing our city, if we want to do that, if we want to have a quality of life in Toronto where everybody can be their best selves, we need to start collecting more revenue.
Next question. Can you explain reserves? How long can we last using up reserves?
Oh, so if I had 2 hours and a keg of beer, I'm sure we could get through it. There are all kinds of different reserves. There are some which are what we call statutory reserves. So as an employer, the City of Toronto is required to put money aside for the pensions of city staff members who are going to retire. Another kind of reserve is when a developer or just someone who owns their home comes in and wants us to review a change that they want to make to their property, maybe a new deck, maybe it's a whole big development. We charge a fee up front for the staff cost of reviewing that. And that reserve can only be spent on the staff cost of reviewing development or building permit applications. Similarly, when a new unit of housing gets built, we collect something called development charges. And the province lets us say, okay, this building will bring 1,000 new people in. 1,000 new people means we need to buy 3 new buses. and there's a formula that the province gives us. 60% of the cost of those new resources we need for the new population, we can charge as development charges. But we have to lay out this much for the TTC, this much for housing, this much for childcare. They each go into accounts that we can only spend on that by law. Then there are some reserves that the city just says, you know what, we need to buy a bunch of fire trucks every 10 years. Instead of paying finding money in the budget in a lump sum once every 10 years, every year through the 10 years, we will put some money aside. Those are discretionary, but we're stupid if we spend them down. I will tell you that one of the things that has caught my eye is that I have never seen a budget that draws so much on discretionary reserves. And that's understandable. They're rainy day funds, and the pandemic is a rainy day. The question I have been asking, and I haven't got a good answer yet, is what is the plan to replenish them once the pandemic is over? And I think that's a thing that I, as your representative, has to be mindful that the decisions I make, affect 20 and 50 years down the road. That's something I have to keep my eye
on. You mentioned a lot of asks from the province and the federal government for money. What happens if they don't pay?
It depends. It depends. We have come up short on constructing housing. The province, like I said, they're just absent. They're just absent. I might as well be asking Jason Kenney for the money. So we're paying more than our fair share. You and I, as Torontonians, are picking up what should be the provincial share right now. But the thing is, there are limits, right? Because unlike either the federal or provincial governments, it's the law that the City of Toronto cannot borrow money for operating costs, and that includes debt repayment. The federal government and the provincial government, when they borrow to build a highway and time comes to pay it back, they can just borrow again. We can't do that. We have to pay it off. So I do argue in certain specific cases that, there are lives at stake here. There's people's futures at stake here. I don't care if Doug Ford is being stubborn. We just have to meet the need. But there's a limit to how far the City of Toronto can go. And I think we have to make it really plain to our friends, to our neighbors, to people we know who live in other parts of Ontario, that we are underwater here in the City of Toronto. Underwater, particularly with day-to-day transit service and housing. Those two areas, we are, to my knowledge, we are one of the worst funded jurisdictions anywhere in North America.
Okay, jumping back to Parkside. This question is, you mentioned that you got money for Parkside Drive that I assume was not in last year's budget. Can money move around after the budget is passed?
To some extent, money can move around after the budget is passed. If it's anything but something very trivial, it has to come to council with what we call a variance report, which council has to vote to accept. I'm notorious. I am the guy who every council meeting is debating what's in the variance report. So they need to tell us if they're moving the money, and council needs to vote on it. And that's a public document, by the way.
Next question is, I'm wondering if this year's budget will affect the timeline for the affordable housing development slated to occur at the corner of Brock and Noble.
Oh, 11 Brock.
11, yeah.
So good news on 11 Brock. the City of Toronto is putting out its request for proposals, any day now, for not-for-profit housing operators to see if they're interested in operating that site. So no, it's ticking along. It's taken far too long, but we should see some real progress this year.
Our next question, are income taxes included in city budgets? If so, would you advocate for proportional taxes for higher earners?
So no, the City of Toronto does not have access to the income tax. We do get, as I showed in that first slide, we do get some federal funding for some things, so indirectly, but no, the City of Toronto does not have access to the income tax. The City of Toronto is bound by a set of provincial laws, one of which spells out explicitly which taxes we are allowed to collect and which we are not. And it's a very, very, very short list. Pretty much, with the exception of the vehicle registration tax, we use all the tools that it makes any sense to use that are in that legislation. And the vehicle registration tax will add about 75 million a year. I advocate that we do it, but we need to change that legislation. We need access to, my preference would be the income tax, but if we can't get that, then the sales tax.
Will you be recommending the property tax is increased more than the 2.9%, considering there's also the 1.5% increase?
So yeah, it comes to a total of 4.4, and I haven't settled my mind. For about 10 years, I moved a property tax increase beyond inflation every year because neither Mayor Tory nor Mayor Ford would do it. Now that we have this city building fund, it's built in. The thing that I used to move every year at council and they would vote down is now built in and automatic. Once we have got through the more detailed reviews, once I've heard more from you and some of the community advocacy agencies and talked to some of my colleagues, I'll have a better sense of where the holes are, how big they are, what some of the things that are being proposed don't make sense for this year and maybe we could do in some future year. And then I'll be in a better position to judge whether this is a time when I will move a budget increase this year. But make no mistake, the City of Toronto, even before the pandemic, we had a structural finance problem. We didn't bring in enough money to deliver the services you depend on in the long term. We're going to run out. And at some point, we have to have the very hard conversation about that new revenue tool source.
Can you explain in general terms how development charges are employed to support the densification of our city?
So I'll give a specific example. We ran into some very big problems at Yonge and Eglinton a little while ago. It became apparent that the number of units being built outstripped the capacity of the water and sewer pipes that went into Yonge and Eglinton area. Development charges are one of the tools that we would use to pay for expanding that water and sewer infrastructure. That's one example. But we also use development charges to manage the additional growth and the additional demands on services for a suite of things. There's a list. It's about 10, 15 things. I don't have it memorized, but it's things like transit expansion, fire and police, childcare, affordable housing, water and sewer. And again, we have to, and I can, if anyone's curious, I can send you, we have to give the province a third-party verified document that lays out, based on the population projections we agree with on the province, what those new infrastructure costs are going to be to the dollar. And we're allowed to charge, I believe it's 60%. It might be a little higher than that now, of the additional infrastructure. We're not allowed to use any of that money for maintaining what we've got or rebuilding what we've got. It's only the additional demands. And as I said, it's not even the whole additional cost. A lot of that gets picked up just through the general property tax system. And we can't put any operating costs in development charges. The theory there, and it makes sense, is that once the unit's built, somebody moves in and they're paying property taxes, and that will cover the additional operating cost.
Okay, our next question. Where does food security fall within the budget?
There are a couple of programs. They're not very big. Some are through our shelter housing and support system. Some programs are through our recreation system. A big one is through Toronto Public Health. That's the school lunch program that we contribute money to. Now, obviously, with the constant disruptions to classrooms, to community drop-ins, these programs are all over the place right now. I'm a very strong advocate for this stuff. I just think that, you know, if you don't have a warm, safe place to live and good, nutritious food, you're just not going to succeed.
Okay, we just have a couple more because I think we're going to wrap up soon. One of them is there anything you wish we asked you about?
Honestly, I am just so overwhelmed right now. I am so overwhelmed. Phone Doug Ford and tell him 22 councillors is not enough. We need to go back to where we were before. I love all of you, but no municipal official in any city, in any democratic country in the world has to represent 110,000 people except the city of Toronto. And it just, the time I wish I was spending with you figuring out these priorities, you should be getting two different, like there should be twice as many meetings, one for what used to be Ward 13 and one that used to be Ward 14. There should be twice as many people advocating for you. I wish you'd asked me about that, but that's because I've had a long day. I think that the things that are going to determine the city we live in are going to be, do we get a real housing program? Do we have a real transit system? Are we able to invest in neighborhood school facilities, libraries, community centers, parks? Those are the three big things that I think make a city. And unfortunately, you know, my first cut is every single one of them is underfunded and badly underfunded. That's why I keep talking about this structural deficit at the City of Toronto and why we need the federal government in this time of crisis to step up, and why we should just be appalled, like absolutely appalled at the behavior of the provincial government. If they had done nothing, I would have a hard time telling a difference between where we are today and where we are in a do nothing circumstance. They've done so little.
Okay, our last question of the night, it's about 8:30, is I'm aligned with you on the vast majority of your priorities. How can I help to influence other councillors?
Why don't we go to the final slide, Sky? It's a perfect transition. I love this question. By the way, while Sky's doing it, thank you all so much for coming here. I didn't see the total numbers, but I know we had a pretty good turnout. 61 now. I know it was a little higher than that. I only sent a few people away. So building a better city is always political work. It's community work. It always has been, and it always will be. And if you just count on the people you elect to do it for you, you won't get the city you want. So you have to stay active. An important and powerful tool is to come speak directly to the budget committee. There are 2 days that are set aside for that. Monday, January 24th and January 25th. And you can see there's an email, BUC, that's for Budget Committee, easy to remember, at toronto.ca. And there's a phone number, 416-392-4666. Well, that's an unfortunate number. I hope it's not a sign of things. And you register, you get, depending on how busy they are, either 3 or 5 minutes. So, focus. What's that one thing you really want to tell those members of council who sit on the budget committee? They also take stuff by email. I will tell you right now, not every member of the budget committee reads every email. There just aren't enough hours in the day. It's much more important to show up. But if all you can do is write an email, it's still good. A tip, send a copy to me, Councillor Perks. It's up there, Councillor_Perks at toronto.ca. So I know you've told them, and I can raise it if you're not there to speak for yourself. 2 important people in deciding what's going to be in the budget are the budget chief, Gary Crawford, and of course the mayor, John Tory. I provided their emails as well. Council, oh, Diana just put something in the chat. Diana has an opinion. I can't tell you if I agree or not. What was I going to say? If you are a true city councillor devotee, and there are a few of you out there, I'll never understand you, but you're out there. The city budget and council meetings are live streamed, and you can follow along. And as you're following along, write me angry emails or phone my office. Be kind to my staff. Nothing is their fault. They actually make the city a much better place. And finally, beyond all of this, I wanted to say something else. Nothing was ever changed because a bunch of good people got elected to a government, not by itself. Everything that has ever been changed has been because a bunch of good people have got together, educated each other and themselves, organized and resisted and fought for change. There are many fine organizations in the city of Toronto. Some work on the neighborhood level. And if you get my regular email update, or you go on my website, there are links to great groups in our community. There are also great groups in the city of Toronto. Some work on specific issues. I'll give a plug to the Toronto Environmental Alliance. I worked there for 10 or 15 years myself before I ran for elected office. Another group that I often plug is something called Progress Toronto. They are a wonderful group of people. I know a lot of you on this call are involved, who do organizing right across the city, especially in wards which have not had that much in the way of progressive representation, to try to build power, to hold those local councillors to account, and also to build power so that when elections come, more progressive people get elected. Whatever it is, whatever your issue is, whatever the thing you care about, coming to town halls like this is great. It puts you already a step ahead above a lot of people who just let the government happen to them. But getting further involved in community organizations and those citywide advocacy groups, that's the next step. I'll tell you right now, we will not get the city we want without advocacy. I think that's a good place to wrap up. I want to thank everybody who was here. We've kept a list of everyone who registered. So we'll be sending some follow-up information where I didn't have the answer, or maybe because I've had to read too much in the last 4 days, I might have made an error on a date or a number. And anything that we discover as we ask questions of city staff going forward. Toronto can be a great city. It's not yet, but nights like tonight are one of the steps on that journey. Thank you so much for participating. I'll keep fighting, and I hope you do too. Have a great night.